Hi, everyone. Welcome to MIT Press Live, a new virtual event series brought to you by the MIT Press. My name is Hannah Nyren. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at the MIT Press, and I will be your host for the series. Today, we are speaking with Wade Roush, author of Extraterrestrials. Hi, Wade. How's it going?
Hi, Hannah. It's going really great. It's really fun to be here.
Great, and I'm so glad you could join us today. So Wade, to start off, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, sure. So I am a science and technology journalist. I live and work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just actually down the street from the MIT Press. I can practically see it out my window. And I spend most of my time writing or making audio, making podcasts about science, technology, politics, social issues, and how we can navigate our way to the future. So in addition to doing a lot of freelance writing, I make a podcast called Soonish, which is my way of exploring the trends that will affect the future. And right now I'm also producing a show for MIT Technology Review called Deep Tech, which takes articles from the magazine and tries to bring them to life in audio form. So I have a bunch of different projects, but as I said, they all come out of this sort of science, technology, and society background. And in fact, I got a PhD in STS from MIT, and so my affiliation with MIT goes way back, which makes it extra special to be working on this project with you guys.
Great, that's awesome. And we're always happy to have an MIT alumnus here. So Wade, tell us a little bit more about your book, Extraterrestrials.
Okay, so this book it's around 50 or 51 or 49 in the series of books in the Essential Knowledge series. And for people who aren't familiar with that series, they should really check out like all 50 titles, because it's kind of an amazing thing. It's an example of a university press deciding that while it's somebody needs to be publishing all those really specialized, really expert-driven and expert-oriented books, there's also a market for more digestible, more approachable, easier to read, shorter books. And so this is one of those books. It's only 5 chapters long, and you can read it in an afternoon. And what it does is it attempts to summarize the history and the science of the idea that we are not alone, right? That there might be intelligent extraterrestrials, there might be people, quote unquote, living on other planets in other star systems. It turns out that's a surprisingly ancient idea, but it's only in the last, century or so that we've been able to approach it from a more scientific point of view. And it's only in the last 60 years or so that we've had the right instruments, the right kinds of telescopes to really start listening seriously to see whether those hypothetical extraterrestrials might be trying to reach us. So far, we haven't heard anything. So that creates its own puzzle. And a large part of the book is about how is it that the math seems to suggest that there ought to be lots of aliens out there. And the reality so far is we haven't heard a peep. So that's creating a contradiction, and that contradiction is becoming more and more perturbing, right? So we'd all like to know the answer, and a big part of the book is goes into speculation about the possible answers.
And that is a lot of what we have, since there's no hard evidence. We do have to spend more time on speculation and figuring out what it could be. So tell me a little bit about what inspired this book.
So it's part biography, personal biography, I guess, and part just the fascination and the depth of the subject. So obviously this question of whether we're alone is one of the biggest unanswered questions in science. It's right up there with, how did life start? Or what is intelligence? Or can we build artificial intelligence? It's one of those kinds of questions that could, having the answer could change everything. So the question itself is really important, but I also have sort of a personal connection to it, which is I grew up in a time in the 70s and 80s when the idea of aliens and depictions of aliens were just all over the place in pop culture, obviously in movies and TV, from Star Trek to Star Wars to Battlestar Galactica. I mean, you couldn't like turn on the TV without seeing an alien. So that idea that we probably weren't alone was already sort of just part of the zeitgeist when I was growing up. Wouldn't have seemed unusual to anyone growing up in the late 20th century for us to actually be contacted. It would have been like amazing and mind-blowing, but in the same way, from a different perspective, like not completely surprising, right? Because we've been thinking about this for a long time. Second thing is, when I was 13, this scientist that everyone has heard of, named Carl Sagan, put out a book and a TV series called Cosmos. This was the original Cosmos, not the Neil deGrasse Tyson remake, which is amazing, but the original was also kind of quite groundbreaking. And it was a show about science and history and our place in the cosmos. And there was a whole episode in that series about the search for extraterrestrials. And that's where I first started to realize that this question about aliens wasn't just a science fiction question. It wasn't just a pop culture question. It was something that scientists were thinking about, and that, moreover, there were ways to start investigating the question. Like there were real scientists spending real money on real instruments to probe the heavens to see if we were alone or not. So the fact that it was a real pursuit was kind of eye-opening to me. And then the third thing that happened was, in the mid-'80s, when I arrived at college, there's just this extraordinary coincidence where there happened to be an event going on my campus where Carl Sagan was in attendance. It was directly related to the search for extraterrestrials. There was a new computer being inaugurated. It had been designed by a physicist at Harvard named Paul Horowitz, and he had raised a bunch of money to build this computer, and some of the money came from the Planetary Society, which was headed by Carl Sagan. So he was on campus to help kind of like officially flip the switch on this computer. And there was a big symposium and a big celebration, and I attended this thing, of course, being a big Carl Sagan fanboy. And I went up to him afterwards, and I, introduced myself and kind of just gushed in all the usual fanboy ways. And he was super nice and super gracious about it. I remember just being impressed at how friendly and welcoming and nice he was. But that stuck with me. It also gave me my first actual journalistic story, because I took the experience of that weekend, and I happened to be trying out for the college newspaper at the same time. The very first assignment was go find a story. So I realized that was my story, and I went back and wrote up a piece about this new computer that was being used and how Carl Sagan and Steven Spielberg were on campus to help inaugurate it. And that was my first ever published story. So I feel, in a way, I owe some of my biography as a writer to Carl Sagan. And this book was an opportunity for me to come kind of full circle and to get back up to speed on everything that's happened in the intervening 35 years. 1985 was, might as well have been a couple of different, eons ago, in terms of what we know now that we didn't know then about the prevalence of other planets in the galaxy and the chances that life has arisen on other planets. We know a lot more about astrobiology and exoplanets and all these key questions than we did then. So there's just a lot more to say, even though the basic answer still, the basic question is still unanswered. So this was a chance for me to really dig into that and come back to all of those, those obsessions from early in my life.
Great. That's awesome. And that's such a wonderful story of how you got into this field, and, how you became a writer in this field, and of course, what inspired this book. So thanks for sharing that with us. So let's get into some of the other questions. So what makes your book different from other books about extraterrestrials? What's your take on this subject?
Well, there are quite a lot of specialized books about extraterrestrials and about astrobiology, in particular about this key conundrum called the Fermi paradox, which boils down to the galaxy is more than old enough to have given rise to many generations of civilizations, and there's been enough time in terms of the billions of years of the galaxy's evolution for at least one and probably many civilizations to pop up, to start colonizing the galaxy physically, if not, maybe they're traveling between stars, maybe they're just sending out signals. Either way, there's been plenty of time for civilizations to arise and to start making their presence known. And yet the paradox being, we don't see any evidence. We don't see any hard, credible evidence that our solar system's ever been visited by aliens or extraterrestrials. So it's a kind of like, it's the contrast between just the math of that leads us to suspect that extraterrestrials probably exist, and the fact that we haven't found any yet. That's the Fermi paradox, and there are plenty of books about that. There are also plenty of books about the whole field of astrobiology, which is the study of under what conditions life might exist on other worlds. There are also plenty of books about planetary science and exoplanets and the new study of how planets form and how common they might be around other stars. A lot more common now, we know, than we would have thought 50 years ago. But what I was trying to do with this book was to bring all that together in a super short, digestible, brief way and try and weave a single unified story of how we've been able to ask this question about whether extraterrestrials exist in a more and more scientific way and a less and less sort of literary or mythical way. And so the final three, it's only 5 chapters, right? But chapters 3, 4, and 5 really delve into this science about astrobiology, exoplanets, trying to solve the Fermi paradox and trying to come up to try to come up with some plausible ideas about how it is that so far it seems like we're the only intelligent beings in the galaxy, but the galaxy is way too old and way too big for that to really be true, right? So where are they? And in the end, I kind of offer some of my own theories about why it's been so hard for us to locate any neighbors and what we might be doing wrong. You know, are we listening incorrectly? Is there something wrong about the way we've been framing the question? That's how the book ends, is by kind of like trying to investigate some possible explanations for the Fermi paradox and some possible directions for the future of the search.
Great. So, you know, just to make it clear for everyone out there, do you actually think that extraterrestrials exist?
I have no idea, right? I think the only legitimate answer to that question is I don't know. I think it's probable, but since we don't have any direct evidence, all you can really say is that it's a giant uncertainty. It's one of the biggest unsolved problems in science. I would like to believe that extraterrestrials exist and we aren't alone, because it would be an exciting and sort of a comforting idea, right? That we aren't alone, that we don't bear the sole burden of being sort of the universe's way to know itself. We don't bear the complete burden of preserving, you know, the only example of consciousness in the whole universe. That would be a little overwhelming, right? It would be really nice if we were able to spread that burden around a little bit. But as far as we know, at the moment, we do bear that burden all alone. So I'd like to believe we aren't alone, but there's no hard evidence either way right now.
So you mentioned that there's no hard evidence about it. So why isn't there any hard evidence? Why have we not found it yet? And if we haven't found it, should we start questioning our assumptions about where and how we might find aliens?
Well, yeah, that question, that is the heart of the Fermi paradox, and that's the core of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is why haven't we found any evidence yet? We've been looking in all the ways we know how to look. And so I think the bottom line is that if there are aliens, they probably are only detectable in ways we haven't invented yet. And we haven't gotten our heads around the question in an adequate way. So you might be tempted to go back and revisit the math and kind of question all your assumptions about, you know, how often do habitable planets actually give rise to life, and how many of those planets where life exists become home to advanced civilizations, and how many of those civilizations ever discover technology or decide they're going to start traveling between stars or sending out electromagnetic signals that other civilizations could detect. It could be that like all of our assumptions about those things are wrong, and that life is much rarer, that intelligence is much rarer than we really think. but there are reasonable ways of answering all those questions that lead you to hypothesize that there should be, dozens, hundreds, thousands, or even millions of other civilizations right here in our galaxy. And so it's a legitimate question why we haven't found them yet. And I think the answer may be that even though we've been looking really hard for about 60 years, looking for aliens and signals from extraterrestrial civilizations on all of the sort of most logical frequencies across the optical and radio spectra, we haven't found anything convincing, right? And I think it may be because we're just still at the very beginning of our search. Like we're just taking our first baby steps into the galaxy, and we're already pretty good radio engineers and TV engineers, and we're already pretty good optical astronomers. But it may just be the case that that extraterrestrials are out there and they're communicating using media or using encoding approaches or languages that we just can't understand yet and haven't really invented or stumbled across. In a way, if we had found extraterrestrials like the moment we turned on our radio telescopes in the 1950s and 60s, that would have been kind of amazing. It would have been perhaps a sign that life is incredibly common. If we had neighbors who were right next door, like one star system over, right? There's been plenty of time for our radio and TV leakage to reach them, and for them to know that we're here, and for them to send a signal back. And in fact, I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, there's this concept called the light cone, which is basically the sphere encompassed by our radio and electromagnetic signals. And since we've been transmitting or leaking signals roughly since the 1930s, our light cone is 80 or 90 light years in radius. So in theory, any civilization within that sphere would have had a chance to notice us and potentially communicate back. So I think what you can conclude from the silence so far is that if there's anybody out there listening, they have decided not to respond, right? And who knows why? But it could be that we're not ready. Who knows? There are all sorts of theories. There's actually a book that details 75 different solutions to the Fermi paradox, and a lot of them are quite compelling, right? It could be that civilizations, once they become sufficiently advanced, they're just not really interested anymore in communicating with less advanced civilizations. There's some kind of wackier theories about how, and this is particularly timely, but there are theories about whether civilizations are inevitably and always sort of overcome by disease and wind up spending so much of their money and their economy, their resources on healthcare that they can't communicate or they can't travel, right? Or different variations on things like that. It could be though that, and this is actually my favorite theory, there are only a certain number, that life is not like, that we're not unique, but we're rare. And that there may be maybe 100 or 1,000 other civilizations out there in our galaxy. But if there's only 1,000 and they were randomly distributed around our galaxy, then the distance between any two civilizations would still be hundreds of light years. And that's just a long distance to cross, even at the speed of light, right? Even just using radio or optical signals. So from that perspective, it may not be surprising that nobody's said anything back to us yet.
That's a really good way of putting it into context. My theory was that they could watch the news and they don't really want to deal with us, but.
There's that too, yeah.
Okay, great. So, speaking of the news, there have been some stories recently about, quote unquote, the recent release of UFO footage from the Pentagon. So, how does the whole UFO phenomenon feed into people's beliefs about extraterrestrials? What's the real story here, and why is it so?
Well, Hannah, that's a question that I knew I would get asked when I started working on this book, and I'm happy to talk about it. I have to say, if anyone goes into the book expecting to read a lot about flying saucers and UFOs and Area 51, it's not in the book, right? I've been trying to kind of stick to the story of the science of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And obviously that intersects with and overlaps with ideas about UFOs and aliens visiting the Earth. And it's completely understandable why people are interested in that subject. The stories that we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks about the videotapes from, Air Force missions over the Atlantic and the apparently hypersonic vehicles that they filmed, those were actually videos that first leaked a few years ago and now have been officially released by the Pentagon. And thus you get like a second wave of coverage. Nothing terribly new about those videos or about the story. But every time there's a new episode like this, it does reignite people's questions about what are these things and could they be of extraterrestrial origin? Mm-hmm. The answer is like maybe, but there are 100 other things like that are higher on the list of likely explanations. I want to be clear, like UFOs exist because any flying object that is unidentified is by definition a UFO. It's just that aliens is one of the last explanations you would turn to. And my guess is that the things that show up on these Air Force videos will turn out to be, who knows, they'll turn out to be either software glitches or artifacts of secret military projects that we don't know about yet. I mean, it's not clear to me that the Army and the Navy and the Air Force are always talking to each other about their own inventions, let alone the state of our intel about, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, other actors. I don't know what those things on the videos were. I'm pretty sure they probably weren't alien craft. And the bottom line for me is if extraterrestrials went to all the trouble to actually physically travel here from a star system, many, many light years away, why would they come all this way and then, basically sneak around and be so secret about it, right? Why would they tease us and entice us and not just come out and make contact? It's just, the rabbit hole goes so deep that I myself have more fun thinking about the science than speculating about all the conspiracy angles on this.
Well, some people might have fun with the conspiracy angle, so to each their own, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, great. So thank you so much for telling us about your book and about whether or not extraterrestrials exist. We do have a lot of time for the Q&A today. And so if anyone has a question that they would like to ask Wade, you can go ahead and use the Q&A feature. I will include directions on how to use the Q&A feature so that no one's confused and you don't have to ask me about it because that'll be a lot of people to respond to. So here you go. Here's the Q&A feature directions. You can see it probably on your screen, but please feel free to ask any of your questions. I know we covered a lot of ground today, but I'm sure that there's more. And in the meantime, we do already have a couple of questions in the chat. I prefer if they go in the Q&A section, but I'll read these now. So this is a bit of a deep question that might be a little too complicated to explain right now. But someone points out that the words intelligence, consciousness, sentience have all been used interchangeably in this talk. So do you believe that they're all the same, or, if life exists on a molecular level in other parts of our universe, would you consider that extraterrestrial life? Do you believe they're all the same thing?
No, I mean, there are all sorts of good reasons to separate those things out. For example, there are cognitive scientists who speculate that organisms could be intelligent without being conscious. And I think the question of like what is sentience is really bound up in a lot of really abstruse philosophy. So it's almost impossible to say what do you even mean by sentience. Um, we might wind up discovering artifacts before we discover actual living extraterrestrials. We might come across derelict spaceships or things that people built or abandoned, Dyson spheres, which are there's one possible sort of science fiction scenario where civilizations that become advanced enough wind up wanting to capture more of the energy from their star, and so they wind up building giant, basically solar collectors that wind up being shells around their entire star. And a civilization that advanced would be one that we ought to be able to detect even from here. And you can imagine a civilization of biological beings that invent or give rise to a civilization of artificial beings, robots, computers, AIs, that then continue their evolution. So the first extraterrestrials we meet could be AIs and not biological beings. And that leads to a whole host of questions about whether AIs can be conscious or sentient, right? But in the end, I guess it all comes down to like, are we alone or not? And if we find someone worth communicating with, then I think that kind of starts to answer this question of are we alone or not? And it helps without having to like grapple with the direct question of what is consciousness and do you have to be conscious to be intelligent? I think those things are really deep questions. And I'm fascinated by them. And I don't think we really even answer them very well right here on Earth. I mean, there are thousands of other species right here on Earth that by any reasonable definition are sentient. And yet we are doing a terrible job of understanding their forms of intelligence, or let alone being able to communicate with them. So the idea that we are ready to start communicating with extraterrestrials from that perspective is a little arrogant and premature.
That is a really good point. I have another question here about Dr. Mae Jemison's project, which I believe are they talking about the 100-year Starship from DARPA?
Oh gosh, I'm not up to speed on that one. I'm sorry.
Well, apparently there's a project where the goal is for the people of Earth to be able to perform interstellar travel in 100 years. So again, I think it might be that project that they're referring to. Is it possible that we need to get that far from Earth to find another possible Big Bang just based on odds and statistics? And by another possible Big Bang, I think they mean life created by a Big Bang.
I do know about the breakthrough initiatives funded by Yuri Milner, who is this science-minded Russian-Israeli billionaire software guru, and he has funded a SETI effort, a search for extraterrestrial intelligence effort called Breakthrough Listen, and he's also funding a project called Breakthrough Starshot, which is intended to design and launch small spaceships that would probably be powered by light. They would be light sails, basically, that we would propel to extremely high speeds by shining a laser from Earth onto these light sails, and they would accelerate to other stars that way. And in theory, could reach nearby star systems in a shockingly short time. Like we're talking decades instead of millennia. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there are those kinds of projects underway, at least at the conceptual stages. And absolutely, one of the reasons to travel to other star systems is to gather better and closer up data about the makeup of other solar systems, what kinds of planets they have, whether there are signs of life on those planets. But there's also a lot we can do right here from Earth or from Earth orbit to search for biosignatures. That is, signs that there may be life doing life's thing, metabolizing chemicals, producing gases that are sure signs of life. we might soon be able to do that from our own satellite telescopes, like the James Webb Space Telescope here, without having to travel to another star system. I think that what the person is really asking is, do we need to get way outside of our own point of view in order to answer this question better? And I think the answer to that is probably yes. And like, the longer we have to think about this question, and the more missions we can design, the better chance we're going to have of solving this problem. And I suspect that we'll wind up discovering primitive life, like bacterial style life, way before we ever answer this question about SETI and the existence of extraterrestrials. In fact, we may find other forms of microbial life right here in our own solar system. There are several places here in our solar system that are potentially habitable. And those are places we ought to absolutely be looking, like Europa, which is one of the larger moons of Jupiter, and Titan and Enceladus, which are 2 moons of Saturn. Those are obvious places for us to go ourselves or robotically and start looking around. But it's a great question.
Great. I have another question here that is about the possibility of extraterrestrials already arriving on Earth and us not knowing about it, which I know you mentioned was unlikely, but this question is, do you think that it's possible that extraterrestrials arrived on Earth in the past and stayed here, either going extinct or still existing among current Earth dwellers? Now, I know it sounds far-fetched, but it could be, I mean, even just an amoeba. Could there be anything from another planet here that we would not know about already?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are very few questions that are off limits to science. You can't figure out some kind of hypothesis that you can explore from a scientific point of view. And that question should be open to investigation. And I guess there are a couple of different ways to think about it. One is that if extraterrestrials came here on spaceships at some point in the past and spent time here, the only way for us to know that would be to find evidence of that in sort of the stratigraphy of the Earth, right? I mean, we've gotten pretty good at studying the layers of sediment, or the layers of different kinds of rock in the Earth's surface. And we know pretty well at this point how Earth has evolved over the last 4 billion years. And we also have a really, really detailed picture of how life has evolved over the last 500 million years. And if there are fossil aliens somewhere in that record, then we ought to come across them at some point. We definitely haven't, right? We haven't found anything that doesn't fit somewhere into the tree of life, the tree of DNA-based life. And similarly, if there were extraterrestrials who had traveled here and then kind of mixed into the population of Earthlings, you know, you would expect that to show up in genomic analysis. We have the technology now to analyze the DNA of any species and to sequence their genomes really fast. And we've done that for thousands of species now. And we haven't found a single example of life that doesn't use DNA. Although it's open to question whether we even have the tools, right? If there's some form of life that's so strange that it doesn't use DNA, that we might not be capable of even detecting it. We might not even recognize it as life. But the point being, so far, we don't know of any organisms that use some genetic mechanism other than DNA. And so, as far as we can tell, every existing organism here on Earth is part of the same kind of giant bush of organisms that arose. We're all Earthlings, in other words. There aren't any non-Earthlings among us. Although there are certainly people thinking about this question of weird life or shadow life, because if it turned out that there had been 2 separate instances of what's called abiogenesis, when life kind of arose from a pre-organic state, if that happened more than once on Earth, that would definitely sort of change your thinking about the odds that it has happened in other places. And people have been thinking and working really hard to figure out if that ever happened, but so far there's no evidence of a second abiogenesis.
Interesting. It's interesting to know that people have been looking for that sort of thing.
Yes, they have.
Great. So here's another question. Someone states that, in their opinion, our current technology is limiting our search for extraterrestrial life. And I'm sure, there are always limits to technology, and the better it gets, the more we'll be able to find. But this person asks, what are your thoughts about the James Webb Space Telescope? Will it be able to detect atmospheric biosignatures on exoplanets, potentially detecting life?
I hope so. That's part of the point of the mission. The James Webb Space Telescope is a very large telescope being designed and built by NASA and its contractors. And the schedule keeps getting pushed back, but the current expectation is that it will be launched and that it'll go into operation sometime in the first half of the 2020s. And in a sense, it's like part of a whole sequence of missions that have been designed around a single goal, which is to help us figure out whether there's life on other planets, right? And so the question you have to ask first is, well, how many other planets are there, right? Are there any planets at all outside of our solar system? Because until the 1990s, we didn't know the answer to that question. Now we know for sure. We have a list of about, it's past 4,000 now. There are at least 4,000 known exoplanets that were discovered by previous missions, including Kepler, and that are being discovered as we speak by an MIT mission called TESS. So our list is growing every day. And TESS is using a specific method called transit monitoring to see whether a star's light dims just briefly, which is a sign that there might be a planet passing in front of it between that star and the satellite. And when that happens, the luminosity of the star dips just enough for us to be able to tell there must be a planet there. And so we're busy kind of cataloging all these exoplanets. And that catalog, one of the reasons that we're building that catalog is so that when we finally launch the James Webb Space Telescope, we will know where to look, right? And that is an infrared telescope. The James Webb is going to be able to look with higher resolution than ever before at these exoplanets. And in theory, yes, it will have the resolution to be able to detect different spectral signatures, different signs of different kinds of compounds in the atmospheres of exoplanets, especially as those planets are passing right between that star and us. So I think the hope is that as we compile this list of exoplanets and as we gain the ability to actually measure the atmospheres of these planets, that we will detect at least one planet, that over the lifetime of the James Webb Space Telescope, if everything works out, the scientists behind the project are optimistic that they will find at least one example of a planet with biosignature gases in its atmosphere. Now, that's still one step away from being able to say that there is life there. I mean, if you looked back at Earth from a great distance, you would see, if you had the right instruments, you could tell that our atmosphere is 22% oxygen, right? And 78% nitrogen and like 1% other stuff. The 22% oxygen is a pretty good sign that there's life here on Earth, because oxygen is such a reactive gas that it doesn't really hang around in the atmosphere. It combines with other compounds and elements so fast that it would just disappear unless it were constantly replenished by something. In our case, it's constantly replenished by photosynthesis and the action of algae and bacteria and trees and plants, other plants, right? So if we found that much oxygen in the atmosphere of some other planet, it would be a sign that life exists, but it's not the only possible explanation. So that it's all like just getting us down this road to having a list of possible locations for life. And I guess maybe in the 2030s or 2040s, we can design a new mission to take an even closer look at those places where we find biosignature gases.
Great. So Someone asked a question about kind of alternate universes as opposed to space. Do we have any data that could possibly determine that, life could exist in another reality?
That's a little bit far afield from what my book is about, but I will say that one of the solutions people have proposed to the Fermi paradox, this idea that aliens ought to be out there, but we don't see them. One of the solutions is that a sufficiently advanced civilization figures out how to occupy different regions of space-time, right? Where Michio Kaku, the physicist, has proposed that that extraterrestrials figure out how to, what he calls, boil space-time and disappear into black holes, or find a different realm to inhabit, so that they're not in our universe anymore. They've moved on to some other parallel, or some other sort of like some other sliver of reality that we don't have access to. So that's, there are real physicists who speculate about these things. There's another theory that really advanced civilizations like to hang out like right above or even inside the event horizons of black holes, because that's the place where it's cheapest to do large scale computation. Like, because everything is so cold and so slow, that would be the best place in the universe to carry out gigantic computations and simulations. So maybe they're all hanging out by black holes. So
Wow.
those kinds of explanations are really hard to test. They're really hard to disprove, and they're really hard to prove. There are even theories that the reality that we inhabit was designed by, or shaped by, or imprinted upon by extraterrestrials. And this is really in the science fiction realm, but there are people like the science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem, who speculate that if we look deep enough, we might find signs that our own reality was engineered in some way, right?
Mhm.
And if fans of Carl Sagan, people who have read the novel version of Contact, the one that was eventually made into that amazing movie with Jodie Foster. In the novel version of Contact, the way the novel ends is with somebody, calculating the digits of pi, and going so far into those digits that they discover that, like, buried deep, deep, deep into the quadrillions or sextillions of digits of pi, there's actually a diagram of a circle, right? If you like line up the digits and turn them into a diagram, you would see a circle. It's speculation, it's science fiction, right? But it's one possible way that, like, you can imagine super advanced beings manipulating reality to imprint their presence somehow on our math and on our physics. And again, really hard to rule out, also really hard to confirm, fun to think about.
Yeah, and I do think that, there are a million possible theories of where aliens have been and could be, but if we don't have any evidence, there's no information to tell us that one is more valid than the other. I mean, we might as well just read science fiction.
Well, can you think of an experiment to investigate that possibility? I mean, all of this relates pretty closely to the simulation hypothesis that, people as famous as Elon Musk subscribe to this idea that the reality we live in is a simulation, right? That we all live in the matrix, to put it in one particular way. And again, I guess that's possible. But if we're all parts of the simulation, then we ought to be able to come up with ways to hack the simulation and discover that, right, at some point. So when I hear theories like that, I want to say, okay, fine, come up with an experiment to prove your idea, and then we can talk.
So there is a way to bridge the science and the science fiction.
Oh, I think science and science fiction are completely symbiotic, and I would never look down at science fiction ideas, because they are, most scientists grow up reading science fiction. It's like, it's the thing we aspire to discover. It's just, science is a more plodding, a more rigorous, slower and more frustrating way to get to the future, but it's the only way we really have. Science fiction is our way of defining the future and figuring out what we want to aspire to.
That's a really good way of putting it. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, Wade. I'm sure that everyone here got a lot from it as well. And if anyone has any additional questions, is there somewhere that they could go to learn more?
Sure. So folks can email me if they'd like. Wade at soonishpodcast.org is my email address. I'm also reachable on Twitter at WRoush, WROUSH, or at Soonish Podcast. And I'd love people to check out that podcast and to read the book.
Great. And I sent a link again to where to find the book and all the different ways you can buy our books right now. So everyone has that link.
Sure.
And thanks again for an amazing talk, Wade.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.